Well, thanks, Marcia and Catherine, for having me back. It's a great pleasure to be back. I saw Steve Ehrlichman in the crowd somewhere. Stephen, another prominent leader of the coalition. It goes back to 2003, I think, doesn't it? So I'm very pleased to be here and put forward my name as a Democratic candidate for the President of the United States of America, and I think everything he said is absolutely wrong, with no redemptive value whatsoever. I start by thinking of two cognitive biases we might have. One is a conflation of political democracy with shareholder democracy. We hold very dear the notion that an individual has one vote and that's it. But it's a little different when you think about shareholder democracy. One vote depends on the number of shares you own. So it is really not democratic, it's plutocratic. The more shares you own, the more power you will have. And I just want to sort of abstract, because I often find myself falling into this pit. When you talk about shareholder democracy, I kind of think one person, one vote, the foundation of a democratic society, but it's different. Second cognitive bias I think that we do have is that widely held companies have always performed brilliantly, that there's some model of superlative performance against which we're going to measure dual-class share governance. I'd remind you that Adam Smith wrote in 1776, commenting on the collapse of the South Sea Corporation, that guardians of people's money other than their own do not look after it with the same anxious vigilance with which they look after their own money. And he described the collapse of that stock market, which very nearly destroyed the British Empire, as coming from the fact that this is a very awkward model where you're brought in to take a look at oversight for somebody else's business. And Irving Olds is my favorite executive of all time, CEO of U.S. Steel in 1940, the largest market cap at the time. He was asked about his board of directors, and Irving Olds said, my directors. The parsley on the fish, decorative but not useful. So we have a long history here. This is a very awkward kind of structure, and it doesn't always work for us. And I think of 2002, Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, HealthSouth, Ahold, Parmalat, that list went on. That led to Sarbanes-Oxley, which had the brilliant idea that maybe the people who ran the audit committees ought to have had some audit experience. And then we did the global financial crisis, where 15 of the world's largest banks lost $2 trillion worth of shareholder value. Made the 1929 depression look like kids' play, $2 trillion. Each of those bank boards were widely held. Each of them had 15 directors, any of whom you would have died to have breakfast, lunch, or dinner with if you'd read their resumes. But collectively, the whole system collapsed. It just didn't work. So we cannot think that this one share, one vote governance model a priori will produce outstanding, consistent results over time for boards of directors. I think the evidence is quite the opposite. It's very serendipitous. Some work, some don't. Fortunately, the coalition has been working hard to improve things in Canada, and I think ISS, if I'm not mistaken, ranks us #1 in terms of governance capacity in publicly traded markets. Is that right, Sarah? You believe so. Do you know so, or do you believe so? Yes. And I think a large part of that has been the work of the coalition under its various leaderships and with the institutional investors who were there. We started 20 years after you did, Ken, not around greenmail, but I think around the fact that the institutions woke up one morning and said, hey, we own a lot of these companies together. Wonder what happens at a board of directors meeting. And so we began to investigate that. One success we've had that you have not matched, and that is we have separated, except in family companies, the chairman from the CEO. And if I'm not mistaken, you're still 50% of publicly traded companies in the US have a combined chair CEO. And is there a good reason for that? Other than it's the way we do it in America, right? So don't ask me any questions. This is how we do it.
It's the way we do it.
That's what I thought. Okay. The problem generally with boards of directors is threefold. Number one, a director comes perhaps 250 hours a year. The management team works 3,000. So it's like an 8% reinvestment. And if you think there's a continuing movement in the markets in which we operate, that's not a lot of time. Number two, they generally speaking are gifted former CEOs, but they're amateurs. So you get somebody who was, I was the CEO of George Weston Limited, and I was put on the board of the Bank of Montreal. I might have been a gifted CEO in my time. I might have experienced a few occasions where I could say I had good business judgment. But what did I know about the Bank of Montreal and its operations? Probably not a lot. So I was a gifted amateur, whereas you have dedicated employees on the other side, completely involved in the business. And the third component, so time invested, not knowing the details of the business, and the third problem is if you are later in your career, you have a portfolio of interests. So I'm on 2 public boards, maybe 3. I have 1 or 2 philanthropic interests. I've got grandchildren who like to go skiing in Banff. I've got another grandson who likes to go sailing in the Bahamas. I have my own massive portfolio to worry about. I have a complex portfolio of maybe 8, 10 things in my life, of which this board is one. So if you think about that, the visual metaphor I use is the Grand Canyon. On one side, you got the management team, 3,000 hours a year, dedicated to running their businesses, doing nothing else, completely focused. And on this side, you got people who drop in from time to time, invest maybe 8% of their lives in it, and are busy doing a ton of other things, and by the way, know nothing about the business. So it's not really surprising we have a lot of meltdowns in the publicly traded sector, even amongst 1 share, 1 vote. I don't think shareholders have managed to get into the boardroom closely enough to be anything as other than surprised when something disastrous occurs. So here are the facts today. Facts today are that there are now 3,750 publicly traded shares on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, down 50%, 50% from 25 years ago. That's a large number. When I generally, in the Director's Education Program, say to the audience, well, what's happened? There were this number, 7,000 publicly traded companies in 1996. What would you guess today? Most people would say, well, I'm probably up by, I don't know, 5%, 10%. Say, no, it's down by 50%, and the same on the London Stock Exchange. And there's reasons for that. There's 2 pushes and a couple of pulls. On the push side, you've got short-termism. Mark Wiseman and Dominic Barton set up Focus Capital on the long term because they were so concerned about the impact of short-termism on companies' long-term futures that they set up a commission with all kinds of wonderful people on it. It's quite an incredible organization. When I asked in my classes, what do you think a plausible time frame is for a strategic plan for, I don't know, Loblaw, Shoppers Drug Mart, something conventional? The answer comes back, what would you say, Kate? 3 to 5 years, something like that? They surveyed 1,000 C-suite executives and directors as a prelude to setting up Focus Capital on the long term. The answer came back, yeah, I think that's what it ought to be, but what it is in the companies I'm involved with is less than 2 years. And the pressure on short-termism has been growing. 86% of the respondents said the pressure's been growing. So short-termism is a huge cost on operating management. And the second push factor out of markets is activism. Last year, there were 470 public campaigns in the United States, 470. For every one that goes public, it's thought there's 3 that don't. So 3 or 4 times 470 is almost 2,000 companies, and there are only 3,700 of them. There are over, by their count of activism, 650 companies today who are solely devoted to activism or mostly devoted to activism. And this is a global phenomenon. So if you're the manager of a publicly traded company, you got to cope with the costs of short-termism. I got to make the next quarter. And you're going to be overwhelmed by the fact that if you are the normal company, you're going to have 3 activist people phoning you up all day, every day. These are real, tangible costs. I think the scarcest resource in any company is the time of the C-suite. And if the C-suite is investing 20% of their time in these things that are coming at them from left, right, and center, that is a huge loss to the long-term potential of the corporation. So with those pushes, there are the pulls of free money and private equity that have exploded. All of you as institutional investors probably have your PE sides now. PE has outperformed any other asset in the marketplace, hugely successful, and there's 7,000 companies now offering you an opportunity to go and buy something or start something up. How many? 2 minutes to go. So the pull is the fact that there's free money and there's all kinds of people involved in persuading the entrepreneurs to get their financing from them, not the marketplace. And to a large extent today, it's capitalism without capital. We're not building canals or railways anymore. It's all IP that's happening. I'm chairman of 2 PE companies. One of them we were going to take public. And we added up the costs, 7% from the underwriting, disclosure and listing standards, 1% a year. Short-termism and activism would probably cost us 20% of our senior management time. We'd have to share our secret sauce in the publicly traded markets, or we couldn't go public. And I'm reckoning that we would get, in fact, we would get half the price by going public that we would if we sold into the private equity market. So there's no reason to go public. The only reason you want to go public is to give some liquidity to some of your employees or your shareholders, perhaps to get some prestige, and to maybe get an M&A currency. And if I'm going public today, all the power is on my side. I will dictate the terms under which I'm going public. And that's the reality, and that's the reason there's been so few IPOs. 100 a year is where we're down to now. And those who do choose to use the public markets will always come with dual-class shares. You mentioned that, Ken. I think the number is last year. There were 110 IPOs, and a full 24% of them, either tech or non-tech, came with dual-class shares. And in the tech stocks, it's now up to 38%. So I would posit that going forward, any company coming public in the next 5 to 10 years is probably going to have dual-class shares. Hong Kong and Singapore have just allowed them. Same reason the New York Stock Exchange allowed them. NASDAQ was winning all their business. And so you're just going to have to live with them. How do we make them better? I don't know. But they're going to be here, and you're going to have to live with them, and they're not going away, and they're there for very good reasons, both the power dynamics of who's got the clout and also the cost dynamics, that there are agency costs that you might not be able to get at as shareholders, but there are also principals costs from activism and short-termism. Other than that, I hope you elect me in the primaries. I'm still going to stand as a candidate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.